So there are, I think there are 5 specific events that are mentioned after the birth of Christ. And I chose 4 of them for the Advent season, and we're going to look at each of them. This week we're going to look at King Herod and what he did, and how Mary and Joseph were forced to flee the country to keep Jesus safe. So we're going to spend a little time there, but over the next few weeks we're going to spend some time talking about those stories that occur after the birth of Christ. Now this is a little weird, a little strange, a little different. I ask you to bear with me. I went back and looked. I keep all of my sermons, I keep them all. And I went back and looked, and I got through 2011, and then I got distracted because I have a little bit of problems with paying attention. But up until that point, I hadn't talked about, I think, 3 out of the 4 of these events specifically for a sermon before. So I'm excited to be able to preach on these. We kind of just blow past them on Christmas Eve. We tell the story of the birth of Christ and the events that occur afterwards, and we never come back to visit it. So today we're going to be talking about King Herod. As we go over this, we're going to be looking at these stories. And one of the questions that I always ask myself is, why is this story in the Bible? And so, when you think of Christmas, you think of warm and fuzzy, right? So, you think of the baby Jesus, wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. You think of the angels singing to the shepherds in the field, glory to God in the highest, and the shepherds coming in, and the wise men coming, and everybody worshiping Jesus. But somehow, this story has always been a part of the birth story. We have a tendency to forget it. Here was a king who was jealous. King Herod was king of the Jews. But he wasn't Jewish. He had converted to Judaism, but he was an Edomite. And he wanted to be the messianic king of the Jews. He wanted to be better than David. He wanted to be greater than any king before him. And he was a very, very, very jealous person. So, how great of a king did he want to be? Well, like any king, he had a palace. But he didn't just have one palace, he had several palaces. In fact, he built a palace near Bethlehem. In Bethlehem, if you go to visit Bethlehem, there's a mountain just outside of Bethlehem that was created by King Herod. King Herod had a mountain built, literally, rocks and dirt piled upon top of one another. And he had a palace built on top of that mountain, 315 feet above Bethlehem. Taller than the pyramids at Giza. And that was important to him, to prove that he was better than the Egyptians. He wanted his palace to sit up on the mountain higher than the pyramids in Egypt. Bethlehem is in the middle of the desert. He had a pool built for his palace, 3 times the size of an Olympic swimming pool, out in the desert. There were probably several people whose only job was to fill the pool up with water day after day after day. And of course, he didn't use the palace all the time because he had a palace in Jerusalem. He also had a palace down on the Mediterranean Sea so that people would know how great he was as they came to visit him in Israel. Come to visit him at Jerusalem. They would have to pass through this portico gate down by the sea, and there was a huge palace there. So here's a guy who is more concerned with how he looks than really what kind of a leader he is. And usually people who are concerned about the way they look in history and through time and to other people are very insecure people. They're fearful. And his actions show that out. Herod wanted to prove to the world that he was the rightful king of the Jews. And so he married into the line of King David. He married a woman who was a member of the Maccabee family, and they had children together. But he was a jealous man. Remember I said he was a jealous man? He had her uncle killed for fear that he would want to be king. He had her killed for fear of what she might do. And he had 2 of his sons who were born to her killed for fear that they would try to overthrow him. You got to be a pretty insecure person to start taking out your own kids. In fact, Caesar is quoted as saying, "It is better to be a pig in Herod's house than to be one of his children." Caesar, the emperor of Rome, knew Herod and knew him well enough to know, don't cross him. So this is the type of person that we're dealing with when the Magi show up one day and say, we're here to worship the king. We all know the story, right? And King Herod sends them on their way to Bethlehem to find the baby Jesus, and he tells them, come back and tell me about the baby Jesus. And the Magi are warned. We'll talk about them, I think it's next week or 2 weeks. We'll talk about them later. I want to focus on Herod here. So there comes a point in this journey when he realizes that the wise men, the Magi, have not done what he wants, and he becomes furious. So furious that he calls for every boy child under the age of 2 to be put to death in the city of Bethlehem. Now, there are some historical accounts that talk about hundreds and thousands of children that were put to death because of this. But the reality is Bethlehem was a small village, wasn't very big. It was the city of David, and it's where the king was to be born. But there probably weren't that many boys under the age of 2. As if that somehow makes it better. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if the police came into the village of Elida and said every boy under the age of 2 must be put to death? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. We have a hard time understanding that here in our Western society because we've never been put in that situation. You see, Mary and Joseph were warned in a dream, and they packed up and they left. They left Bethlehem and they went to Cairo, Egypt. From Bethlehem to Cairo, Egypt, it's a pretty well-traveled road, but it's nothing but desert and a few oases. There are some people who said it took between 30 and 60 days to travel through the desert. We have no concept of that in our Western culture. The only thing that we can come close to is every once in a while we will see tidbits on the news about people who are refugees, who are fleeing a dictatorship and going from one country to another. And we see these poor, tired people marching wherever they're marching, from one country to another or one community to another. They're trying to flee the oppression that is coming down upon them. You see them. They're dirty. They're tired. They're marching along. You see the mothers clinging to their children. You see the fathers trying to keep families together. You see the different checkpoints. You see the refugee camps. It's nasty, and it's dirty, and it's ugly. When you talk to Christians of the Middle East, and you ask them what is the story of the Christmas birth that rings most true, and one of the things, especially for the Christians of the Gaza Strip and of Lebanon, for the Christians of Israel, for the Christians who hide in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran, one of the stories that they cling to the most is this story. This story that shows that Jesus was one of them, one of the persecuted, one of the lost, one of the least. And that he had to run for his life from an oppressive king, a murderous king, a king who would do anything to protect his reign. You see, we don't want that to be what Christmas is about. We're much happier with Christmas trees and angels and shepherds. It's much more comfortable Christmas. But as we go through this next 4 weeks, and as we look at these stories, we'll get to some of those warm and fuzzy stories, but the reality is that somebody has been trying to take away Christmas from the very beginning. I told to the kids here when we talked about the Grinch during children's time, and that there's always somebody trying to steal Christmas. And the original Grinch was Herod. And he died being that person who was jealous for his kingdom. He wasn't afraid to put people to death. He wasn't afraid to force people to build his kingdom so that it looked good to those on the outside. He wasn't afraid to be the evil, murderous king that he was. He didn't care what other people thought. He just knew that he had to protect what was his. We all have a little bit of King Herod in us, don't we? That's the hardest thing to admit. The hardest thing to admit is that sometimes I feel like King Herod. That when somebody does something to one of my kids that I think is wrong, the first thing I want to do is, well, let the murderous king out, right? You want to protect what's yours. You're willing to do anything. Maybe you let jealousy get in behind the mask that you carry around with you all the time. And you see somebody who has something that you're jealous of, and therefore you treat them poorly because they have it instead of being happy for them. We have that tendency to let the jealousy sneak out every once in a while. So as we begin this Advent journey, as we begin to look at ourselves in the mirror, as we begin to prepare for Christmas, maybe even, dare I say it, as we try and get off the naughty list, we can take a look in the mirror and admit that sometimes we do get jealous and maybe try a little bit harder to straighten out our lives. To be honest with the anger that we feel towards other people and to look at where it's coming from. To maybe go the extra mile and treat somebody that we don't like with kindness to see if it changes their world. Or maybe to look at it from their perspective, and maybe it's jealousy that drives them to do what they do. We all have that little bit of King Herod in us. And Advent season is about preparing for the coming of Christ, of being better, of doing better. That's my challenge for you this week. To be a little bit better, to be a little bit nicer. Dare I say it? Let somebody have that parking space in front of you that's super close to the door, that you really, really want, and you saw first. To be nice, and to love one another, and to not let that murderous jealousy take hold in our hearts. To maybe let our hearts grow a couple sizes larger, like the Grinch. To let Christmas come alive, and to not let it destroy us. It destroyed King Herod, and it made Jesus, still our Messiah, a stronger person for having lived through that difficult time. An example for us to be different, to put that jealousy behind us, to leave it in the rearview mirror, to live life to the fullest, and to stick with God's plan, no matter where it takes you. Will you pray with me? God of grace and mercy, we give thanks that you can teach us even through this most horrible act of murder. That your love for us is so great, that you seek us even in the midst of our jealousy and our rage, and ask us to change and to be more like you. And for that, we give you all the thanks